The desert stretches endlessly under the pale glow of the rising moon dunes, rolling like frozen waves across the horizon. A thin wind stirs the sand, lifting tiny grains into ephemeral clouds that shimmer in the faint light. The air is dry, carrying the scent of earth and stone, yet even in its stillness, it hums with latent tension. Shadows stretch long across ridges and hollows, creating patterns that shift imperceptibly as the dunes undulate beneath the gentle push of the wind. In this vast expanse, nothing is stationary. Every ridge, every dip, every faint ripple in the sand holds the potential to surprise, to challenge, to test the instincts honed by generations of survival. Night folds into the desert with slow deliberation. The stars emerge scattered like pinpricks of cold light against an endless black canvas, their reflected glow dancing on the shifting sands. A thin layer of frost has formed on exposed stones, hinting at the extremes of temperature that this environment demands from its inhabitants. Every inhaled breath carries the subtle whisper of wind. Over dune crests, the distant rustle of hidden life, stirring cautiously aware of the omnipresent danger that the desert enforces silently. The atmosphere feels both vast and intimate, as though every grain of sand holds the memory of countless struggles, each moment of life balanced delicately against the unyielding forces of the environment. The rhythm of the desert is not constant. Shadows lengthen and compress as the moon arcs across the sky, altering perception and concealing threats. A slight gust reshapes the surface of the sand, erasing traces of movement and creating deceptive patterns that challenge the mind's interpretation of space and distance. Time itself seems to stretch. Seconds feel elongated, magnifying every subtle motion, every adjustment of wind, every glint of moonlight across the undulating dunes. The environment teaches patience, demands attention, and reveals that even the most practiced instincts may falter in the face of shifting variables. As darkness persists, the landscape reveals an intricate web of potential and peril. Sparse shrubs cast long angular shadows that dance across ridges, while shallow depressions trap wind and create subtle distortions in the sand. The terrain is a living puzzle. Each ridge, each valley is a test of perception, reflex, and timing. A faint ripple in the distance might be the result of wind or the passage of unseen life. Yet the uncertainty is enough to create hesitation, tension, and heightened awareness. Every movement, every sound or absence of it is amplified, each contributing to the oppressive weight of the desert night. The desert breathes slowly, rhythmically, in a way that seems indifferent to the creatures within it. Microcurrents of air shift, subtly carrying the slightest hints of activity, a faint scrape of claws on stone, the rustle of sand displaced by a hidden rodent, or the quiet movement of a predator adjusting position. The environment is a constant interlocutor, providing signals that are almost imperceptible yet laden with meaning. One misread cue can cascade into missed opportunity, exposure, or failure, and the desert's impartiality ensures that even small misjudgments are costly. There is an underlying principle in the stillness in this world. Even instinct is tested, and certainty is fleeting. The unfolding patterns suggest that not all behavior follows predictable laws. Even the most honed reflexes may encounter circumstances where survival requires more than habitual response. Subtle changes in wind direction, the faint shimmer of heat over a distant ridge, or an unexpected ripple in the sand, can create situations where traditional instincts falter. The desert, with its extremes of light and shadow, temperature and texture, reminds every observer that adaptation is ongoing, and that even the most reliable patterns are subject to disruption. The atmosphere is charged with expectation, though no event has yet erupted. There is a quiet weight to the space. Each shadow and glint of moonlight feels deliberate, a prelude to the trials that will unfold. The dunes appear both familiar and alien, their surfaces constantly reshaped by forces invisible yet exacting. This tension, subtle, unrelenting, and omnipresent, establishes the core of the theme in nature. Instinct alone is not always sufficient. Even in environments honed by evolution, small deviations, miscalculations, or unforeseen variables can carry profound consequences. As the first hints of dawn approach, the pale glow on distant ridges begins to blur the stark contrasts of night. Yet the desert retains its authority. Its rules remain exacting, its potential for disruption ever present. Shadows still conceal subtle variations in sand, continue to obscure and reveal, and the weight of uncertainty lingers in every ripple, every movement, every stillness. The stage is set. The theme implied, survival is a delicate negotiation between instinct, environment, and the unforeseen. And in this world, even the most practiced reflexes may falter, leaving space for hesitation, for error, and for consequences yet to unfold. The desert night has solidified into a quiet, almost hypnotic rhythm. Yet beneath the apparent stillness lies a complex matrix of rules and consequences that govern every movement. Each dune ridge and depression is not merely a feature of terrain, but an element in an intricate system where success and failure are determined by an exacting interplay of perception, timing, and adaptation. Shadows stretch and contract as the moon arcs across the sky, creating illusions of movement and depth that can deceive even the most experienced predator. The desert's silence is deceptive. It conceals as much as it reveals, demanding constant vigilance and precise interpretation of every subtle signal. Within this environment, the act of hunting is an exercise in understanding the invisible laws of interaction. Prey movements, although subtle, are highly consequential. A rodent's whisker twitch, a faint paw tremor on loose sand, or a sudden shift in posture can signal either opportunity or threat. Predators must translate these minute cues into immediate calculated decisions. Any misjudgment can result in wasted energy exposure to rival hunters or failed capture. In the desert, the margin between survival and failure is measured not in large dramatic events, but in these infinitesimal fluctuations which collectively define the rules of engagement. Predatory hierarchy in this environment is fluid, yet precise. Each species or individual operating independently occupies a niche defined by its sensory capabilities, agility, and risk assessment. The most experienced hunters move with calculated restraint, accounting for wind terrain and the subtle environmental cues that signal prey behavior. The timing of action is critical. A glide taken too soon may alert prey. A pause too long may result in missed opportunity or territorial encroachment by competitors. These dynamics are part of an unwritten code of survival, where instinct is necessary but not sufficient. Adaptation memory and observation must complement innate behavior for survival to be maintained. Environmental conditions further codify the rules. Wind shifts unpredictably, altering scent trails and the propagation of sound across the open dunes. Temperature gradients affect muscle performance and timing. The terrain itself imposes constraints. Unstable ridges, sudden depressions, and scattered vegetation create both hazards and advantages, requiring a predator to continuously adjust its approach. Even minimal changes, a pebble disturbed by wind, a shifting shadow from a dune's crest, must be incorporated into decision-making. The desert teaches that the consequences of ignoring these subtle variations are immediate and measurable. Time of day plays a pivotal role in the enforcement of these laws. Nocturnal hours provide concealment, but also introduce visibility constraints. Twilight and moonlight affect shadow length and depth perception, subtly altering the perceived location of prey or competitor. Each decision is therefore doubly weighted. It must account for the behavior of potential targets and the temporal variations in environmental cues. The desert's rules are not static. They evolve with each hour, and compliance requires constant observation, interpretation, and recalibration. The desert's inhabitants operate according to these implicit laws, often without overt interaction. Prey species develop patterns to reduce exposure, cautious emergence, freeze and flee behaviors, and subtle micro-adjustments in movement to confuse predators. Predators in turn learn to anticipate these behaviors, adjusting approach vectors and timing to exploit minor errors. Even a small deviation, misinterpreting a shadow, reacting to a false scent, or misjudging wind direction can cascade into significant consequences. The landscape and its occupants form an interconnected system where survival is dictated by the precise execution of movement and interpretation of signals. Competition among predators adds another layer to the law of the desert. While direct confrontation is rare, indirect influence is constant. The presence of multiple hunters shifts prey behavior subtly, yet consistently. A rodent that has detected one predator may adjust its route indirectly, affecting the success of another. The owl, or any apex hunter, must incorporate these unseen influences into its calculations. Understanding that territory, prey behavior, and competitor presence are all interlinked in a complex network of cause and effect. Observation alone is insufficient. Each action must be carefully measured against predicted reactions. Glides, dives, and perches are executed with micro-adjustments informed by environmental factors and prior experience. Talons, wings, and eyes operate in synchrony to respond to both anticipated and unforeseen variables. The desert enforces discipline through immediate feedback. A failed glide, a misjudged landing, or a misread shadow can directly impact energy reserves and subsequent opportunity. These dynamics codify the rules of survival, highlighting the necessity of both instinct and adaptive intelligence. Even seemingly minor environmental factors have magnified consequences. Subtle changes in the moon's angle, shifting sand ridges, and temperature fluctuations collectively affect prey activity, predator efficiency, and the overall risk landscape. The owl must interpret these overlapping variables continuously, integrating sensory input, prior experience, and anticipation of prey behavior to maintain the delicate balance between action and restraint. The desert's laws, though implicit, are exacting adherence, ensures survival. Misjudgment entails immediate penalty. This system of rules culminates in an understanding that instinct alone cannot guarantee survival. Patterns of behavior are reinforced or challenged by environmental shifts, prey adaptation, and competition. The night demonstrates that even in familiar terrain, the interplay of variables creates scenarios where instinct must be moderated by judgment. The desert's law is clear to survive. One must navigate a web of subtle cues, unseen forces, ontophores, and temporal changes, acknowledging that even slight misalignment can result in failure or missed opportunity. By the end of the night, the principles of the desert are firmly established in the observer's mind. These laws of wind, shadow, prey behavior, and competitor presence set the stage for the challenges that will unfold in the story's central chapters. The stage is prepared, the rules are in place, the environment is mapped, and the observer recognizes that when instincts fail to account for this complexity, survival is imperiled. This setup bridges the cinematic intro with the unfolding narrative, subtly reinforcing the theme that even finely tuned instincts are not always sufficient for survival. A faint shimmer of moonlight cuts across the crest of the dunes, illuminating a path that seems straightforward, yet is fraught with subtle hazards. A lone owl moves cautiously along the ridge wings, flexing with delicate precision as it scans the terrain below. The desert is deceptively silent. Every grain of sand, every ridge, and every shadow carries significance. The prey beneath is unaware, moving according to instinctual patterns. But the owl hesitates, a subtle pause, almost imperceptible, that immediately alters the rhythm of the night. The first expectation is instinctual. The predator should strike swift and decisive, capitalizing on the prey's exposure. Yet the owl lingers, talons flexed, but uncommitted eyes tracking every micro-movement. Shadows cast by distant dunes flicker as wind brushes across the ridges, distorting depth perception and challenging habitual judgment. The desert, normally predictable in its harsh logic, introduces an anomaly. What should be automatic is interrupted. The observer senses the deviation. The friction between instinct and circumstance and tension begins to accumulate. Beneath the ridge, a small rodent pauses, whiskers twitching, sensing subtle vibrations in the sand. Its movement is ordinary, yet the owl interprets each twitch differently due to the accumulated fatigue and environmental complexity of the long night. The predator's hesitation magnifies every micro-movement, stretching seconds into prolonged assessment. A slight gust shifts the sand, subtly altering the apparent trajectory of prey, and the owl recalibrates its approach. Here the desert's rules are not suspended. They are enforced with impartial precision. One misjudgment could cascade into wasted energy exposure or lost opportunity. The moment of deviation, the chapter's core is subtle, yet decisive. Instead of committing to a glide, the owl hovers, micro-adjusting wings and talons, eyes flicking between shadow and sand. The prey, unaware of the hesitancy above, begins to scurry cautiously toward shelter. The predator's pause, imperceptible to most, introduces a shift. The balance of opportunity and control begins to tilt subtly. The owl's instincts are challenged by environmental variables, wind shifts, moonlight distortions, and terrain irregularities, all of which create a scenario where action is not guaranteed to succeed. Consequently, the owl experiences the first tangible consequence. The prey reaches a slight depression in the sand, a minor terrain feature that offers concealment. The previously straightforward opportunity has narrowed, requiring the owl to recalculate distance, glide path, and timing. Each adjustment is incremental, measured, yet laden with consequence. The desert amplifies the effect. Minor errors in judgment become pivotal, and hesitation transforms a simple hunting sequence into a delicate negotiation with the environment and its unseen variables. In this chapter, the theme emerges clearly. Instinct alone does not guarantee success. Even in familiar terrain, deviations, micro-pauses, misjudgments, environmental distortions can erode the advantage of a predator. The observer perceives the delicate interplay between the owl's trained reflexes and the unpredictability of the surroundings. The desert's silent logic ensures that every action or inaction carries measurable consequence. The owl's initial pause, though slight, has altered the trajectory of the hunt and reinforced the principle that survival requires more than habitual instinct. Shadows and terrain continue to challenge perception. The owl hovers briefly, muscles tense, talons flexed, wings adjusting minutely to account for subtle gusts. The prey, now partially concealed, reacts to faint environmental cues. Whiskers, twitch, pause, shift, and the owl interprets these changes instantaneously, weighing probability against risk. The narrative tension increases gradually. The predator must negotiate a complex matrix of variables, and the outcome is uncertain. The chapter emphasizes that small deviations from instinctual behavior, when compounded by environmental unpredictability, can generate meaningful shifts in survival outcomes. The chapter concludes with a subtle cinematic observation. The owl glides carefully toward the partially concealed prey, aware that success is no longer guaranteed. The desert, indifferent yet exacting, frames the predator's hesitation against the broader theme. Even finely tuned instincts can falter, and survival is contingent upon adaptation to variable circumstances. The first story chapter sets the stage for subsequent sequences, introducing the audience to the delicate interplay between instinct, environment, and consequence, and reinforcing the core message that in the wild, the margin for error is narrow, and even small lapses carry cost. The first rays of dawn begin to soften the edges of the dunes, yet the desert remains unyielding, its cold shadows lingering across the sand. A lone owl navigates a narrow pass between two ridges, its wings gliding in calculated arcs, talons lightly brushing against patches of uneven terrain. In this confined corridor, the rules of engagement are subtle, yet unforgiving. Micro-movements, faint shadows, and the slightest disturbance in sand dictate the potential for success or failure. The prey below is cautious, moving predictably. Yet the owl senses that the familiar rhythm of hunting may not suffice. Instinct suggests a direct descent, a glide that would, under normal circumstances, secure prey with minimal expenditure of energy. But the owl hesitates briefly, pausing mid-air, assessing variables previously overlooked. A small rise of sand, an unexpected gust twisting shadows across the terrain, and the prey's subtle adjustment in stance all contribute to a moment of uncertainty. The desert magnifies the significance of these minor deviations. The audience is led to expect a swift, decisive strike. But the owl's hesitation introduces the first sign of irregularity in the sequence, highlighting that instinct is no longer infallible. The first consequence of this hesitation is immediate. The prey senses a faint shift in air pressure, a subtle disturbance caused by the owl's hovering, and it freezes momentarily, altering its position slightly. The owl recalculates its wings, flexing in micro-adjustments. Talons extended, but uncommitted. The expected sequence: predator moves, prey reacts, predator strikes, is interrupted. A rhythm that should have been automatic is disrupted by environmental complexity and accumulated stress, creating a cascade of uncertainty that echoes through the remainder of the hunting attempt. As the owl hovers, shadows play across the sand, creating deceptive patterns. A ridge casts a flickering silhouette, elongating and compressing, distorting perception. The prey moves toward what seems like safety, but the terrain itself hides unexpected dips and hollows. The owl adjusts, continuously gliding and hovering in a delicate balance of energy, expenditure, and risk assessment. Each micro-decision is weighted: act too soon, and the prey escapes. Hesitate too long, and opportunity vanishes entirely. The desert enforces its rules without malice, and the owl must navigate the consequences of both instinct and miscalculation. Simultaneously, the owl senses subtle traces of a competitor nearby. A fox, partially concealed, moves silently along an adjacent ridge. Though not directly threatening in this moment, its presence alters the dynamics of the hunt. Prey that might otherwise behave predictably now adjusts subtly, and the owl's pause, once a minor anomaly, now carries amplified significance. Environmental variables and competitor presence combine to transform a routine hunting scenario into a complex negotiation where no choice guarantees advantage. The pivotal moment, the chapter's Kwankak Lek Nip, occurs when the owl, poised for a final descent, miscalculates the distance to the prey due to a subtle distortion of shadow and wind. Its glide is marginally off angle, and the prey seizes the moment, darting toward a small hollow previously obscured. The predator must correct mid-air, talons flexing and wings adjusting instantaneously, but the minor misalignment results in a temporary loss of leverage. The prey gains even a slight positional advantage, and the owl's energy is expended without immediate success. Consequently, the owl must retreat briefly, moving to a higher ridge to reassess. This forced rift in the sequence demonstrates a critical aspect of the theme. Even finely tuned instincts can falter when environmental variables combine in unpredictable ways. The desert has amplified a minor deviation, transforming it into a tangible disadvantage. The audience witnesses a predator forced to adapt in real time, highlighting that survival is contingent not solely on instinct, but on the continuous integration of perception, experience, and environmental assessment. The retreat is measured, deliberate, yet charged with tension. The owl's wings flex with micro-adjustments to maintain balance over shifting sand. Every flap and glide is calibrated against residual uncertainty, shadow patterns, wind shifts, and the potential movements of both prey and competitor. The audience perceives the compounded pressure, the subtle escalation of risk that transforms the desert from a backdrop into an active participant in the story. By the chapter's end, the prey has moved to a safer position, gaining a slight but meaningful advantage. The owl pauses on a high dune, breathing subtly, wings folding with controlled precision, surveying the terrain for the next opportunity. The first lesson of the morning is clear: hesitation, even minimal, carries consequence. Small deviations from instinctual sequences are magnified by environmental factors and the presence of others, reinforcing the central theme that instinct alone is insufficient when the environment is unpredictable and dynamic. This chapter closes with a cinematic acknowledgement of the desert's impartiality. Shadows lengthen, wind stirs loose sand, and the owl, though undeterred, remains fully aware that each subsequent decision will carry the weight of the morning's miscalculation. The stage is set for the next chapter, with risk-heightened opportunities narrowed, and the theme of survival against compounded unpredictability reinforced. The sun has begun to climb higher, casting long shadows that stretch and warp across the undulating dunes. The owl moves with deliberate caution, wings barely stirring the thin morning air, talons flexing as it navigates a narrow corridor formed by two intersecting ridges. The desert has changed since the last encounter. Subtle shifts in sand, newly exposed crevices, and the scattering of sparse vegetation have altered the terrain in ways that are almost imperceptible but consequential. Every instinct that has served the owl reliably in past nights now encounters a subtle misalignment, creating a fragile tension in the rhythm of survival. Beneath the ridge, prey emerge cautiously, their movements calibrated by instinct. The audience expects a swift and decisive attack, a sequence in which instinct dictates immediate action. Yet the owl hesitates. Its head tilts, eyes scanning shadows and micro-movements in the sand. A slight wind gust scatters grains across the ridge, creating visual distortions that complicate distance perception. The familiar patterns of approach are disrupted, and the predator's internal calculation must adjust in real time. The minor pause stretches seconds into prolonged evaluation, amplifying tension and suspense. The first sign of deviation becomes evident. A small rodent previously stationary reacts to subtle environmental cues. A shadow shifting a sound too faint for human ears and adjusts its trajectory slightly. The owl must recalibrate its glide path to intercept, accounting for this minor but significant alteration. Every micro-movement, from the subtle flick of wing feathers to the flex of talons, is executed with precise deliberation. The desert magnifies these adjustments. A minor error now carries tangible consequence. Instinct alone is insufficient. A second factor complicates the sequence. The owl detects traces of a competitor, a fox, moving silently along a distant ridge, observing the scene. Though no direct threat is present, its mere presence alters the dynamics of hunting. The prey senses this additional layer of risk, adjusting movement in subtle ways, while the owl must integrate the competitor's potential interference into its own decision-making. The pause that initially seemed a simple hesitation now has amplified impact. The desert enforces consequences through the compounded variables of terrain, prey, and competitor. The Quenkek leknip arises when the owl initiates a glide toward a partially exposed prey, only to miscalculate the effect of a shifting shadow. The dune's curvature and the subtle gust of wind create a distortion in perceived distance. Talons extend, wings adjust, but the approach is slightly misaligned. The prey seizes the opportunity, moving into a shallow hollow that was previously hidden. The owl is forced to correct mid-air, expending additional energy and disrupting the anticipated flow of hunting. A minor misstep, yet the desert magnifies its consequences. Forced to retreat briefly, the owl ascends a higher ridge to reassess. The prey has gained positional advantage, and the predator's energy is now slightly depleted. The landscape has shifted, not dramatically, but in ways that emphasize how small anomalies can cascade into meaningful disadvantages. The audience witnesses a predator navigating the delicate interplay between instinct, environment, and unforeseen variables. Each choice carries compounded risk, reinforcing the theme: instinct alone cannot guarantee survival in a dynamic, unpredictable environment. Throughout this chapter, environmental variables continue to influence the sequence. Shadows stretch and contract as sunlight intensifies, altering perception of depth and distance. Subtle temperature gradients affect lift and muscle responsiveness, while residual wind currents alter trajectory calculations. Even minor ripples in the sand caused by gusts or the movements of distant animals can change the outcome of a strike. The owl integrates these subtle cues continuously, micro-adjusting wings, talons, and posture with every moment. Each adjustment is consequential, highlighting the fragile balance of survival. By mid-morning, the owl executes a second glide toward a new target. Talons flex wings angle, and the glide is precise, yet the prey exhibits unpredictable micromovements. A minor ripple in the sand, a faint shadow shift, or an abrupt adjustment in posture disrupts the predator's timing. Success is no longer guaranteed by instinct alone. The desert enforces its impartial rules. A single misjudgment, however small, carries immediate cost. Energy reserves are affected. Spatial positioning is compromised, and the opportunity for a straightforward capture is reduced. The chapter concludes with a cinematic observation of the owl's response to these compounded variables. The prey has relocated to a safer position. The owl pauses atop the ridge wings, folded eyes scanning micro-movements in sand and shadows. The previous misalignment has created a ripple effect that will influence subsequent hunting sequences. The desert remains indifferent, yet the consequences of hesitation and environmental complexity are palpable. The chapter reinforces the theme even finely honed instincts may falter when the environment introduces unexpected variables and survival is contingent on adaptation, perception, and recalibration. The desert midday sun casts stark shadows across the undulating dunes, highlighting every ridge, depression, and subtle contour of the sand. The owl glides low over a narrow pass between two dunes' wings, adjusting minutely to compensate for shifting thermals. The terrain, previously predictable, now offers a series of subtle traps, small depressions where prey may hide wind-scoured ridges that obscure micro-movements, and patches of loose sand that can impede landing. The owl's instincts indicate a straightforward path, swoop, strike, and secure the prey. Yet as it moves, minor inconsistencies in the environment begin to challenge the sequence. The prey below moves cautiously, whiskers twitching paws, shifting over uneven sand, responding to subtle environmental cues. The audience expects a clean execution, a seamless glide, an instinct-driven strike. But the owl hesitates. A thin gust of wind alters the trajectory of dust along the ridge, casting false shadows that distort depth perception. The predator micro-adjusts its wings, talons extending yet uncommitted. The anticipated flow of instinct is interrupted. The prey's movement, previously predictable, now seems slightly altered, as if the environment itself has added a new layer of complexity. The Quenkek-Lek-Neep occurs when the owl initiates a glide toward the prey, only to realize the sand beneath the landing zone is less stable than expected. Talons extend, wings tilt, but the trajectory is imperfect. The prey, sensing the slightest imbalance, shifts into a shallow hollow, partially concealed by shadows. What should have been a simple, decisive capture becomes a delicate negotiation with terrain, light, and wind. The desert amplifies the effect. A minor miscalculation turns into a tangible loss of advantage. Forced to adjust mid-flight, the owl recalibrates its approach, micro-flexing wings and repositioning talons. Each movement consumes energy and adds cognitive load. The prey has gained even a subtle advantage, altering the predator's expectation of a straightforward strike. Environmental complexity compounds the hesitation. Shadows distort wind gusts, scatter sand unpredictably, and subtle thermal currents affect lift. Instinct alone is insufficient. The owl must integrate real-time environmental feedback into every adjustment. A second variable appears. Traces of a competitor predator, a fox moving silently along an adjacent dune, introduce an indirect influence. Prey behavior becomes less predictable, reacting not only to the owl's presence, but to potential threats from another predator. The owl must account for this in its decision-making, further complicating the sequence. What was a single action now exists within a multi-layered matrix of risk, opportunity, and environmental variables. The owl's hesitation, initially a minor anomaly, now has amplified consequences. The owl's energy reserves are gradually depleted. Every adjustment, every micro-movement of wings and talons exacts a toll. Hunger presses, but the priority remains precision and survival. Even minor misalignments, slightly off angle, glide a misjudged shadow, now carry tangible cost. The desert enforces discipline errors, however subtle, ripple through subsequent attempts. The audience sees a predator negotiating the environment's complexity in real time, reinforcing the narrative that instinct alone cannot guarantee success. The prey, aware of shifting danger, moves erratically, testing the owl's adaptive response. Micro-adjustments in position, sudden freezes, and rapid retreats all require immediate recalibration. The predator interprets each subtle cue and recalculates trajectory, timing, and energy expenditure. The expected outcome, prey, captured efficiently, is no longer certain. The sequence transforms into a prolonged negotiation with the environment and the prey, with suspense magnified by each environmental variable. The chapter concludes with a cinematic observation. The owl retreats to a higher dune to reassess prey, partially concealed energy, slightly depleted. The desert remains indifferent, yet every misalignment, hesitation, and environmental variable is consequential. Shadows lengthen as the sun arcs higher, wind shifts subtly, and the terrain continues to dictate the parameters of action. The first half of the day's hunting sequence illustrates that small deviations from instinctual behavior are amplified by environmental complexity, creating a cascade of consequences. The final lines of the chapter reinforce the theme: instinct, though honed and precise, is insufficient in a dynamic, unpredictable environment. Survival depends on continuous observation, adaptation, and recalibration, and even minor errors can alter the balance of advantage. The stage is set for the next chapter, with heightened risk, narrowing opportunities, and the desert's impartiality, emphasizing that even perfect instinct may falter when variables collide unexpectedly. The midday sun now casts a harsh, blinding light across the dunes, transforming familiar contours into deceptive plains of heat and shadow. The owl moves cautiously over a narrow valley, wings beating with micro-adjustments to maintain balance over loose sand and hidden dips. The prey below has sensed movement, twitching in minor, unpredictable ways. Instinct suggests a direct glide, yet the owl pauses briefly, a hesitation born of subtle environmental anomalies, shifting sand, misleading shadows, and the faint presence of a competitor on a distant ridge. What should have been an automatic strike is now layered with calculation, uncertainty, and the pressure of accumulated fatigue. The first expectation is straightforward. The owl would descend, secure the prey, and continue. Yet the desert's complexities intervene. A minor ripple in the sand, a shadow that shifts faster than anticipated, and a gust of wind obscure depth perception. Talons extend, wings adjust, but the trajectory is subtly off. The prey senses the slightest discrepancy and reacts, darting into a hollow partially shielded by shadows. The owl must correct mid-flight, micro-adjusting wings and talons. Energy is expended without immediate gain, and opportunity is lost. The audience perceives instinct faltering, illustrating that even highly refined behavior is susceptible to environmental complexity. A secondary factor compounds the challenge. The owl detects a faint scent, another predator, a fox moving unseen along a distant ridge. Though indirect, this presence alters prey behavior. Subtly, movements become erratic, pauses elongated, and routes toward cover adjusted. The predator must now interpret environmental cues in combination with competitor influence, a cognitive load that amplifies the consequences of hesitation. What was initially a small deviation has now escalated into a layered problem, where instinct alone cannot navigate the complexity. The Quenkak-Lek-Nip crystallizes when the owl commits to a descent. A sudden, unanticipated shift in the wind changes the trajectory of its glide. Shadows distort the apparent distance to the prey. Talons reach for the target, yet the micro-misalignment results in a near miss. The prey escapes further into concealment, gaining a slight but critical advantage. The owl adjusts, mid-air, wings flexing, body tilting, to maintain momentum and balance. The desert's impartiality magnifies a minor miscalculation into a significant loss of advantage, reinforcing the theme that instinct alone may not suffice. The owl must retreat briefly to a higher vantage wings, folding talons, flexing eyes, scanning for micro-movements in the sand and shadows. The prey's advantage is now established. Energy reserves have been partially depleted, and the predator's timing has been disrupted. The desert remains indifferent, yet the consequences of hesitation are tangible. Prey has escaped immediate capture, and subsequent hunting sequences will be influenced by this shift. The audience witnesses the intersection of environmental complexity, competitor influence, and physiological strain, emphasizing the fragile balance of survival. Throughout the sequence, the desert amplifies small variables. Shadows lengthen, wind alters micro-patterns in sand, and the subtle movements of distant competitors introduce additional uncertainty. Every flap of wings, every adjustment of talons, and every recalibration of trajectory carries heightened consequence. The owl must integrate sensory input memory and anticipation in real time. What might appear trivial, a flick of a whisker, or a shift in shadow, can dictate success or failure. Instinctive behavior is challenged continuously, revealing the limits of what habitual responses can achieve. Energy management becomes critical. Hours of micro-adjustments, pauses, and precise flight maneuvers accumulate fatigue. Muscles are tense, yet partially depleted, requiring careful modulation to avoid overexertion. Hunger presses subtly, adding internal pressure to act decisively. Yet the environment demands deliberation. Every decision is now framed by the compounding effects of prior hesitation and environmental variability. Success is no longer guaranteed by experience or skill alone. Survival depends on integrating instinct with adaptive decision-making under real-time complexity. The prey's movements continue to evolve, reacting not only to the owl's presence, but to the layered environmental and competitive factors. Micro-pauses, erratic scuttles, and shifts toward cover transform what might have been a simple predatory strike into a nuanced negotiation. The owl must assess these changes instantly, adjusting altitude, wing angle, and approach velocity with precision. Failure is costly, wasted energy, lost opportunity, and increased exposure to competitors are immediate repercussions. By the chapter's conclusion, the prey has reached relative safety, gaining a subtle but decisive positional advantage. The owl perches briefly on a ridge wings, folded talons flexing in calculated tension. The desert remains silent, indifferent, yet every micro-decision from this chapter will influence subsequent attempts at capture and energy management. The audience is left with the realization that even highly refined instinctual sequences can falter when environmental complexity, competitor presence, and cumulative fatigue intersect, reinforcing the central theme. When the environment introduces subtle but impactful variables, instinct alone is insufficient to ensure survival. The desert sun has reached its zenith, casting harsh, unrelenting light across the dunes. Shadows are short but stark, creating sharp contrasts across ridges and hollows. The owl moves cautiously along a narrow saddle between two steep dunes' wings, flexing in controlled micro-adjustments to maintain balance on shifting sand. The prey below is alert, moving with measured caution, guided by instinct honed to detect even the faintest disturbance. What should have been a predictable hunting sequence is now layered with complexity. Wind gusts, shifting shadows, and the residual presence of competitors have combined to challenge the owl's normally reliable instincts. Instinct dictates that the predator should glide, did you even strike? Yet the owl hesitates a subtle pause as it evaluates the terrain, the micro-movements of the prey, and the wind that twists the patterns of sand in unpredictable ways. The first expectation of the audience is a swift, decisive attack. But the owl's pause immediately signals disruption. Shadows elongate and compress, creating illusions of depth and distance that make precise timing difficult. The prey, responsive to subtle environmental cues, adjusts its movements just enough to complicate the strike. Every micro-adjustment of wings and talons is now weighted with consequence. The Quenkek Leknip arises when the owl begins a descent toward the prey, only to misjudge a subtle dip in the sand that shifts its glide path. Talons extend, wings tilt, but the trajectory is imperfect. The prey detects this minute misalignment, seizing the moment to alter its course toward a shallow depression, partially shielded by shadows. The predator must correct mid-air, expending additional energy and breaking the rhythm that instinct would normally dictate. The desert magnifies minor miscalculations. Hesitation, environmental distortion, and prior fatigue coalesce into a tangible disadvantage. Environmental variables continue to complicate the sequence. Wind gusts sporadically shift sand grains, distorting micro-cues of movement. Shadows from distant ridges create deceptive patterns, and the sun's harsh light alters perception of distance. The owl must integrate these signals instantaneously, micro-adjusting wings, talons, and posture to maintain control. Energy reserves, already taxed from hours of continuous assessment, become critical. Each micro-decision carries compounded consequences. A slight misjudgment could cost a future opportunity or expose the owl to competitors lurking nearby. A competitor's presence adds another layer of uncertainty. A fox partially concealed on a ridge mows with silent precision, subtly influencing prey behavior. The prey, aware of multiple threats, acts unpredictably, pausing, darting, or retreating in ways that defy simple anticipation. The owl's usual instinctual calculations are insufficient. Perception must be complemented with continuous adaptation. What might have been an automatic strike now requires heightened awareness, precise timing, and ongoing reassessment of risk versus reward. Fatigue begins to influence decisions. Muscles are tense from repeated micro-adjustments, wings heavy from constant correction, and talons flexed for prolonged periods. Hunger presses subtly, yet cannot override the necessity for precision. Each misalignment or delayed reaction increases the cumulative cost of prior hesitation. The desert is impartial. Minor errors cascade into significant consequences. And the owl's performance is measured not by singular successes, but by the totality of decisions under sustained pressure. The prey continues to react unpredictably, guided by both environmental cues and the implicit threat of competitors. Micro-adjustments in posture, flicks of whiskers, and changes in gait challenge the predator at every step. The owl must interpret and integrate these subtle signals, recalibrating trajectory, timing, and energy expenditure with precision. The anticipated success of instinctive action is repeatedly undermined by compounded variables, creating a sustained tension that highlights the limitations of instinct alone. By mid-afternoon, the owl executes a final glide toward a partially exposed prey. Talons extend, wings adjust, yet the minor distortion in terrain forces another correction mid-air. The prey seizes an opportunity, moving into a hollow that provides even greater concealment. The owl must retreat to a higher ridge, wings folding in controlled tension, eyes scanning for residual micro-movements. Energy is partially depleted, advantage is lost, and the desert continues to impose its exacting rules. This chapter closes with a cinematic observation. The owl perched atop a ridge, talons flexed, wings folded, surveying a terrain that has shifted subtly yet meaningfully during the encounter. Shadows lengthen as the sun continues its arc. Wind stirs the sand, and micro-variables continue to influence potential outcomes. The chapter emphasizes that instinct alone is insufficient. Survival depends on real-time integration of sensory input, environmental interpretation, and adaptive recalibration. The audience is left with the realization that the stakes have reached a heightened threshold. Minor deviations in behavior, compounded by environmental complexity and competitor presence, have reshaped opportunity. The owl's hesitation and misjudgments have tangible consequences, and the desert remains indifferent. The stage is now fully set for the story's Cao Trao Chung, with tension at its peak, opportunities narrowed, and the theme of survival against compounded unpredictability reinforced. The desert is transformed in the late afternoon. the sun casting harsh golden light across the rippling dunes. Every ridge and hollow becomes a subtle test of balance perception and reflex. The owl glides low, wings angled for precision, talons flexed as it navigates a narrow pass littered with unpredictable sand pockets and minor ridges that could destabilize a landing. From the air, the terrain seems simple, yet the cumulative effects of shifting sand shadows and gusts of wind create a deceptive complexity that has challenged the predator all day. Instinct, finely tuned and honed through countless nights of hunting, is insufficient in the face of this layered environment. Below, prey moves cautiously, responding to micro-variations in light, scent, and vibration across the sand. The audience expects the owl to act decisively, striking with precise timing and perfect execution. Yet hesitation, subtle, ingrained by prior errors and environmental feedback, delays the glide. Shadows stretch in unexpected ways, creating optical illusions that distort the perceived location of prey. The predator micro-adjusts wings and talons, but each movement consumes energy, and the prey exploits these tiny pauses to shift toward slightly more concealed positions. This is the KOSAO Trao Chung, the convergence of previous challenges. Every chapter leading to this moment, the hesitation, misjudgment, environmental variables, competitor presence now coalesces into a singular tense scenario. The desert amplifies each minor deviation. Instinct is no longer a reliable guide. Even slight miscalculations result in tangible consequences. Energy reserves, positioning, and timing must all be recalculated continuously. The owl must reconcile accumulated fatigue, previous mistakes, and unpredictable terrain in real time, while micro-adjusting for prey behavior that has evolved to exploit any hesitation. A gust of wind sweeps across the pass, displacing sand and distorting shadows. Talons extend as the owl initiates a glide, but the trajectory is subtly misaligned due to the uneven terrain beneath. The prey, a small rodent, senses the slightest movement and alters its path, slipping into a shallow hollow partially shielded by shadows. The owl must correct mid-flight, wings flexing in rapid, precise micro-adjustments to maintain balance and attempt interception. Every motion is measured against compounded risk. Misjudged timing or angle could waste energy, alert competitors, or allow the prey to escape entirely. Environmental variables multiply in complexity. Heat waves shimmer along distant dunes, subtly distorting visual cues. Shadows of rocks and ridges shift unpredictably with changing sunlight angles. Gusts of wind disturb loose sand, masking micro-movements of both prey and predator. The desert, indifferent yet exacting, imposes relentless pressure. The owl's accumulated hesitation now becomes both a liability and a survival mechanism. Past errors inform present judgment, yet the margin for further misstep is infinitesimal. Competitors also influence the scene indirectly. A fox moves silently across a ridge while unseen snakes navigate hollows below. The prey, sensing multiple threats, reacts erratically. The owl must anticipate these responses, recalibrating trajectory and energy expenditure for each micro-movement. What might otherwise have been a straightforward predatory strike has evolved into a complex negotiation with the environment, prey behavior, and competitor presence. Instinct alone is no longer sufficient. Adaptive cognition is critical. Micro-pauses and wing beats, minute adjustments of talons, and subtle body tilts dominate the sequence. Each movement carries the weight of accumulated fatigue, prior hesitation, and environmental complexity. The prey's position, previously predictable, shifts in real time. Shadows distort perception, and wind gusts add uncertainty. Every adjustment is executed with surgical precision, yet success remains uncertain. The desert magnifies the smallest errors, illustrating that survival is contingent upon continuous assessment, not simply instinctual reaction. Eventually, the owl executes a final glide. Talons extend, wings adjust for lift, and balance trajectory calculated against multiple variables. The prey darts into partial cover, exploiting the smallest gap created by prior hesitation. The owl corrects mid-air, yet energy reserves are depleted, and the opportunity is diminished. The scenario exemplifies the theme: even finely honed instincts fail to ensure success when the environment introduces compounded, unpredictable variables. The predator's actions are measured deliberate and precise, yet the outcome is not guaranteed. As the chapter unfolds, the audience observes the cumulative consequences. Prey partially escapes. The owl's energy is partially depleted and positioning is suboptimal for subsequent attempts. The desert remains impartial, silent, and exacting, emphasizing that survival is never assured. Instinct is challenged continuously, and minor deviations propagate into tangible consequences. The narrative demonstrates the fragility of reliance on instinct alone and reinforces the theme that in a dynamic, unpredictable environment, the desert exhales as the day wanes, heat rippling across the dunes and casting long, soft shadows that stretch toward the horizon. The wind stirs lightly, lifting grains of sand into ephemeral currents that shimmer in the fading light. Every ridge, hollow, and scattered shrub holds the imprint of movement from the day, the tracks of prey, the subtle disturbances of wings, and the faint echoes of struggle. The landscape appears tranquil, yet beneath the stillness lies the accumulation of countless decisions, minor hesitations, and fleeting miscalculations. Nature has recorded them all silently, observing the interplay between instinct and circumstance. The owl perches atop a ridge, wings, folded eyes scanning the shifting textures of sand and shadow. Energy spent, opportunities gained and lost. The predator remains vigilant, yet reflective in posture. The prey it has pursued earlier continues to move cautiously within the terrain, ever aware of both visible and hidden threats. Shadows lengthen, light softens, and the desert seems suspended in a delicate equilibrium. A silent acknowledgement that even in apparent stillness, the rules of survival remain exacting and impartial. The theme resonates throughout this quiet scene: instinct, even when finely honed, is not always sufficient to guarantee survival. Tiny deviations, environmental complexity, and accumulated fatigue have shaped outcomes across the day. The owl's previous hesitations, each micro-decision and minor misalignment, have carried consequences that ripple beyond the immediate sequence of events. The desert demonstrates that the margin between success and failure is narrow, and that survival is dictated not solely by skill or instinct, but by the continuous integration of observation, adaptation, and timing. Dunes shift subtly under the breeze, and shadows compress and stretch in response to the angle of the waning sun. The prey, now partially concealed, adjusts movement in response to faint environmental cues. The owl, perched in patient stillness, reflects a tension between readiness and restraint. The narrative invites the audience to consider the broader implications in an environment governed by nuanced variables and relentless uncertainty. What does it truly mean to survive? The interplay between instinct, hesitation, and consequence has shaped the predator's day, leaving lessons encoded in both movement and in action. The desert stretches beyond sight, vast and indifferent. Each grain of sand is a silent witness to the events that have unfolded, each shadow a record of decision and consequence. The owl shifts slightly, micro-adjusting posture, wings flexing with deliberate care. Every minor adjustment signals continued engagement with the environment, yet the outcomes of the day remain unresolved. Success, failure, advantage, and disadvantage are all intertwined in a continuum where no choice is absolute and no instinct guarantees certainty. As the light fades further, the landscape softens, and the observer is left with the realization that the desert's impartiality persists. The owl's choices, the prey's responses, and the subtle influence of wind, shadow, and terrain have combined to create a narrative of survival that is at once precise and unpredictable. The day's events have concluded, yet the story itself remains open, echoing the theme that instinct alone cannot always secure survival against the complexity of environment and circumstance. A final gust of wind lifts grains of sand across the ridge, swirling into patterns that shift and reform with graceful unpredictability. The owl lifts slightly wings, adjusting with micro-precision talons, flexing lightly. The desert remains expansive, silent, and exacting a reminder that while instincts guide, they do not always determine the outcome.